In the heart of an unforgiving winter, where the snow stretches endlessly and silence feels more alive than the wind, there are things that should never be disturbed. Jess, an experienced hunter, knew the forest well, its paths, its sounds, its dangers. But even she could not prepare for what was waiting that day. Picture this: the crackle of frost beneath your boots, the cold air cutting through your lungs, and the eerie stillness of a forest blanketed in snow. Now imagine that same stillness hiding something far worse. It started as an ordinary hunt, a quest for survival in the wake of a brutal storm. But deep among the trees, Jess would find herself face to face with a terror no hunter should ever encounter. What began as a simple pursuit of prey would unravel into a nightmare of impossible tracks, glowing eyes, and a creature that defied the very laws of nature. As she crouched behind a fallen log, rifle in hand, Jess had no idea that she wasn't alone. Something else was moving through the forest, something that wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't just watching her, it was following her. And as she would soon discover, in this frozen wilderness, there are things far more dangerous than the cold. So, I ask you, if you were alone in the woods and something unnatural started tracking you, what would you do? Jess had always trusted the woods. For years, she and her husband Frank had relied on its bounty, hunting for their survival in the harsh winter months. But this time was different. The storm had changed everything. 3 days of relentless blizzard had left their supplies critically low. Frank, bedridden with illness, was in no condition to join her. And so, Jess ventured into the frozen wilderness alone, rifle in hand, determined to bring back the sustenance they desperately needed. The forest was deathly silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every crunch of snow beneath your boots, every breath that escapes your lips in a plume of mist. Jess moved carefully, her sharp eyes scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement. The buck was her target. Its tracks were fresh, leading her toward a clearing where the trees opened up to the pale, sunlit sky. She crouched low behind a fallen log, steadying her breath as she raised her rifle. The glint of sunlight off her scope briefly caught her attention, but she dismissed it. Her focus was on the buck. It stood alone, separated from the herd, its head dipping low to graze for what little sustenance remained beneath the snow. Jess lined up her shot, her finger brushing against the trigger, her heart pounding in anticipation. But just as she prepared to fire, the buck's head snapped up. Its ears twitched, its body tensed, and in an instant, it bolted into the dense trees, disappearing before Jess could react. Confused, she lowered her rifle, scanning the clearing. She hadn't moved. She hadn't made a sound. So what had startled it? For a moment, she thought the sun's reflection off her scope might have given her away. Cursing under her breath, she adjusted her position, frustrated by the lost opportunity. But as she stepped into the clearing to follow the buck's tracks, an unsettling thought crept into her mind. She wasn't the only predator in these woods. Jess brushed the feeling aside, convincing herself it was just the cold and hunger playing tricks on her. She focused on the tracks, deep and clear in the fresh snow. The buck couldn't have gone far, and Jess was determined to find it. But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't yet know, was that she wasn't the only one tracking the buck that day. And something else was already tracking her. As Jess trudged through the snow, her breath fogging the icy air, her eyes locked onto the trail left by the fleeing buck. The tracks were fresh, easy to follow, and she felt confident this would be a straightforward hunt, until she noticed something that made her pause. Her footsteps faltered, her eyes narrowing as she crouched low to the ground. There, alongside the buck's delicate hoof prints, was another set. At first glance, they might have seemed normal, but as Jess traced their outline in the snow, her stomach tightened. These prints were massive, twice the size of any deer hoof she'd ever seen. They pressed deep into the snow, almost unnaturally so, as though whatever had made them carried an unworldly weight. She instinctively reached out, her gloved hand hovering over one of the prints, measuring the size against her own. It wasn't just the size that was off. The edges of the prints were sharp, almost claw-like, as though they weren't meant for soft ground, but for something far harder and more unyielding. Her heart began to beat a little faster. In the woods, tracks told a story, a fleeting moment of an animal's life, a snapshot of movement. But these didn't fit into any story Jess had ever encountered. She followed the path with her eyes, her gaze drifting across the white expanse of snow. The tracks stretched on, perfectly aligned, unbroken. They were not the panicked leaps of a fleeing animal. No, these were calm, deliberate. Each step was measured, purposeful, as though whatever had made them knew exactly where it was going. And then the realization hit her like a gust of freezing wind. These tracks, they were following hers. Step by step, they mirrored her own trail, weaving through the trees as though shadowing her every move. Jess's pulse quickened as she stood upright, her rifle now feeling heavier on her shoulder. A chill crawled down her spine, deeper and colder than the winter air. For the first time, she turned and glanced over her shoulder, scanning the forest behind her. The trees stood still, their bare branches creaking in the faint breeze. Nothing moved, yet the weight of being watched pressed heavily on her. She tried to shake off the unease, forcing herself to focus. It could have been anything, she reasoned, a moose maybe, or a freakishly large buck. But no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, the image of those clawed, oversized prints burned into her mind. She tightened her grip on her rifle and pressed forward. The buck was injured, and it wouldn't be far now. She had to remind herself why she was out here, survival. But even as her boots crunched over the snow, her thoughts circled back to those prints. Something about them didn't just feel strange, they felt wrong. As if they weren't meant to be there. As if they didn't belong in this forest. As if they didn't belong in this world. And then there was the silence. The oppressive, unnatural silence. The kind that made her ears strain for a sound, any sound, to break the tension. But there was nothing. No rustling leaves. No distant calls of birds or scurrying of small animals. Just the faint whistle of the wind and the crunch of her boots. Jess tried to convince herself it was just the aftermath of the storm, a quiet calm after days of chaos. But deep down she knew better. This wasn't the peaceful silence she had grown accustomed to in the wilderness. This was different. Heavy. Suffocating. She quickened her pace, her eyes flicking between the buck's trail and those hauntingly large prints. She kept telling herself it was fine, that she was overthinking, that she had hunted in these woods for years and nothing had ever gone wrong before. But that logic did little to quiet the growing dread gnawing at her chest. And then another thought struck her, a thought she couldn't ignore. If those tracks had been following her, if whatever made them was this close, why hadn't it shown itself yet? Was it waiting? Watching? Or was it already closer than she realized? Jess clenched her jaw, refusing to stop. She had a job to do, and no amount of irrational fear was going to keep her from finishing it. But as she moved deeper into the forest, her resolve wavered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the hunter here. She was the prey, and whatever was tracking her wasn't far behind. Jess followed the trail relentlessly, the streaks of blood in the snow her guide. She could hear it now, the labored breathing of the injured buck, the faint groans of an animal in pain. As she broke through the tree line into a clearing, her breath caught. There was, just ahead, collapsed near the base of a withered tree. Its body heaved with each shallow breath, its legs twitching weakly as though trying to summon the strength to stand. Jess knelt down, steadying her rifle. She whispered an apology to the creature. It was never easy, but survival required sacrifices. She aimed for a clean kill, but just as her finger brushed the trigger, she saw something that froze her in place. The tracks the oversized ones that had been following her continued beyond the buck. They led into the forest, deeper into the shadows, where something impossibly large loomed. Her heart thudded against her ribcage. For a fleeting moment, she considered turning back, but the sound of the buck's whimpering pulled her attention back to the present. She had to finish what she started. She had to end its suffering. Jess took a step closer, her boots crunching softly in the snow. That's when it happened. The buck's body jerked violently, its limbs convulsing as though struck by an unseen force. Jess stumbled backward, her rifle trembling in her hands as she watched in horror. The animal's flesh began to ripple unnaturally, its skin splitting open along jagged lines. Black, oily tendrils erupted from its back, writhing and twisting like living shadows. Its antlers snapped and reformed into grotesque, sharpened spires that pierced the air. Jess's breath caught as the buck's head twisted at an unnatural angle, the bones cracking audibly, until its face no longer resembled anything earthly. Before her eyes, the creature rose to its feet on two legs. It towered over her, its skeletal frame impossibly thin yet menacingly strong. LTS skin was black as night, stretched taut over jagged protruding bones. The antlers atop its head were impossibly sharp, their ends glinting like blades in the dim light. But it was the eyes that stopped Jess cold. Burning like molten embers, they locked onto her with a terrifying intelligence, as if the creature knew her, had been waiting for her. Jess stumbled back, her rifle slipping slightly from her grip. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. The creature tilted its head, the movement unnervingly slow and deliberate. And then it opened its mouth, releasing a sound that no living thing should be capable of making. A deafening roar that was part animal scream, part guttural growl, and entirely otherworldly. The ground beneath Jess seemed to vibrate with the force of the sound, her ears ringing as she instinctively raised her rifle. She fired. The shot echoed through the clearing, and for a brief moment, Jess thought she had a chance. But the creature barely flinched. The bullet hit its shoulder, yet it didn't bleed. Instead, the impact seemed to be absorbed, disappearing into the inky blackness of its skin. The creature's burning eyes narrowed, and Jess felt a wave of dread unlike anything she had ever experienced. It took a step toward her, its long, clawed fingers extending as if reaching for her. Jess scrambled back, her feet slipping on the icy ground. She fired again and again, but the creature kept coming, its movements fluid and predatory. She turned to run, her boots digging into the snow, her heart pounding in her chest. But the sound of the creature's footsteps behind her told her she wasn't fast enough. It was faster, stronger, and it wasn't done with her yet. Jess ran with everything she had, the icy air burning her lungs, and her boots slipping on the snow-covered ground. The trees around her blurred as she sprinted, her ears filled with the pounding of her own heart and the monstrous sounds of pursuit. She could hear the creature behind her, its guttural growls growing louder, the heavy thud of its steps closing the gap with terrifying speed. Her thoughts were frantic. She had faced predators before, bears, wolves, but this wasn't a battle of survival against a creature of nature. This was something else entirely, something that defied all logic. She glanced back over her shoulder, just in time to see a clawed hand swipe through the air where she had been moments before. Jess stumbled, catching herself against a tree, but the delay was enough for the creature to close the distance. She could feel the searing heat of its fiery gaze on her back, a sensation that sent a chill straight to her core. Desperately, Jess yanked her revolver from its holster, her trembling hands fumbling with the weapon as she turned to face the monster. It was closer now, its towering frame barely an arm's length away. She raised the gun, her breath catching as she saw those ember-like eyes burning with rage and hunger. With no time to aim, Jess fired. The deafening shot echoed through the forest, and the creature recoiled, a spray of black ichor erupting from its head. For the first time, it stumbled, its massive frame faltering as it let out an otherworldly howl of pain. Jess didn't wait to see if the shot had done enough. She turned and ran, her bleeding leg throbbing with every step, her vision narrowing as panic overtook her. But the creature wasn't done. Behind her, she could hear its guttural snarls, louder now, more enraged. She risked another glance over her shoulder and saw it struggling to rise, its skeletal frame twisting unnaturally as it fought to regain its footing. Blood, if that's what the thick black liquid could even be called, dripped from the massive hole in its head. Yet its burning eyes remained fixed on her, brighter than before, as if fueled by an unrelenting hatred. Jess pushed herself harder, her hands clutching at the trees for balance as she slipped and stumbled. Her vision blurred, her strength waning, but she refused to stop. She had to get away. She had to survive. The forest seemed endless, the snow heavier, the cold biting deeper into her skin with every step. And still, the creature followed. Finally, her legs gave out. Jess fell hard into the snow, the cold biting into her skin as she struggled to crawl. Her revolver lay just out of reach, and the sound of the creature's footsteps grew louder. It was right behind her now. She could feel its presence looming over her, its breath hot and rancid against the back of her neck. With a desperate cry, Jess lunged for the revolver, her fingers just barely grasping the handle. She twisted onto her back as the creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Jess pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, hitting the beast square in the chest. It staggered, its massive frame collapsing forward, pinning her legs beneath its weight. Jess screamed as pain shot through her body, the monster's blood soaking into her clothes, its heat scorching her skin. For a moment everything was still. The creature lay motionless, its ember-like eyes dimming as its massive body went slack. Jess pushed against its weight with trembling arms, finally managing to free herself. She crawled away, dragging her injured leg through the snow, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. But as she turned to look back, she saw it, those eyes, flickering faintly like dying coals, locked onto her one last time. It didn't move, didn't growl, but in that moment, Jess felt its message as clearly as if it had spoken. This wasn't over. Jess turned away, forcing herself to her feet, leaning heavily on her rifle as a crutch. She stumbled forward, each step a monumental effort, her mind swimming with exhaustion and pain. The house wasn't far now. She could make it. She had to make it. When she finally reached the door, her strength gave out. Jess collapsed against the frame, her bloodied hands fumbling to push it open. Inside, the warmth of the fire hit her like a wave, but she barely felt it. She dragged herself across the floor, calling for Frank with the last of her strength before everything went dark. Jess woke hours later, her leg bandaged, her body trembling from shock. Frank's worried face hovered above her, but even in the safety of her home, the nightmare didn't feel over. As she glanced out the window, she swore she saw it, those burning eyes watching her from the treeline, waiting for the chance to strike again. Months passed, but the scars remained, not just on Jess's leg, but deep within her mind. The physical wounds healed slowly, each painful step a reminder of the night she barely escaped with her life. Yet, it wasn't the pain that lingered. It was the memory of those eyes, burning, watching, waiting. Each night, as Jess sat by the fire in the safety of her home, she found herself staring at the window. The shadows beyond the glass seemed darker, the forest quieter. The world she once knew as a place of solace had become alien, every creak of the trees and rustle of the wind a possible sign of its return. The dreams came soon after, Night after night, she relived the terror, the towering frame, the monstrous roar, the unbearable weight of its fiery gaze. In her dreams, she was always running, always fighting, but never fast enough, never strong enough. She would wake drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, convinced that the creature was just beyond her door. But the nights weren't the only time she felt its presence. Even during the warmth of summer, when the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Frank tried to reassure her, but she could see the worry in his eyes. He didn't understand the depth of what she had faced. How could he? The thing she encountered wasn't just a predator. It was something far worse. Something beyond comprehension. Jess and Frank eventually moved, leaving behind the forest that had once been their home. Their new house, nestled closer to town, seemed like a fresh start. Jess told herself the creature was gone, that it was tied to those woods, that it wouldn't follow them. And for a while, she believed it. Life settled into a fragile sense of normalcy, and the nightmares began to fade. But then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the sky, Jess found herself drawn to the window. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was a habit she couldn't break, or maybe some deeper instinct warned her. She stood there, staring out at the edge of the tree line, her breath catching in her throat. And then she saw them, two faint, glowing red eyes, just barely visible against the darkness. They didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared, as if locked onto her. A chill ran down her spine, and for a moment, she thought she was imagining things. But deep down she knew. It was out there, watching, waiting. Jess slowly stepped back from the window, the familiar fear creeping back into her chest. She turned away, but the memory of those eyes lingered, burning in her mind like a warning. She didn't know when, or if it would come for her again. But one thing was certain. The nightmare wasn't over. If you were in Jess's position, what would you have done? Do you think the creature is still out there, waiting for the right moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us tonight for this harrowing tale of survival, fear, and the unknown. Jess's encounter reminds us that sometimes the most chilling threats aren't the ones we expect, but the ones lurking just out of sight. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and hit subscribe to join us for more spine-tingling true horror stories. Your support keeps these stories alive. This was just one of many chilling tales we have in store. Anticipate something more eerie,